May 29th, 1453. Constantinople. The first sensation is not of sight, but of sound and smell, a monstrous and unnatural assault on the senses that announces the death of a world. The air, thick and heavy like a wet shroud, carries the metallic tang of fresh blood, mingled with the acrid, greasy smoke of 1,000 fires, a stench of scorched stone and human terror that clings to the back of the throat. Beneath it all is a sound unlike any battle, a dull, inhuman hum that emanates from every corner of the violated city, the collective noise of 100,000-man army engaged in systematic plunder, the splintering of doors, the shattering of marble, the distant rhythmic screams of women, and the guttural shouts of soldiers drunk on victory and bloodlust. Through this hellish landscape, a solitary figure on a magnificent white stallion moves with an unnerving, icy calm. He is just 21 years old, but his dark eyes, set in a pale, determined face, hold the ancient weariness of a man who has communed with destiny and bent it to his will. This is Sultan Mehmed II, riding through the ruin of his ultimate ambition. He passes the shattered husk of the Theodosian walls, the legendary land walls that had protected the city for a millennium, now breached and broken like the jaw of a colossal skeleton. He sees the bodies piled in the streets, the desecrated churches, the river of looted treasure flowing towards the Ottoman camps. Yet his face registers neither elation nor horror, only a profound, chilling focus. He is not merely a conqueror surveying his prize. He is an inheritor claiming his birthright, the master of a new age walking through the tomb of the old. His gaze is fixed forward, toward the heart of the city, toward the colossal dome that pierces the smoky sky, the great church of Hagia Sophia, the epicenter of Orthodox Christendom for 1,000 years. This was the target, the symbol, the soul of the city he had vowed to possess or die trying. The ride through the dead city is not a victory lap. It is a final, solemn act of transformation, the moment a man and a city are simultaneously erased and reborn under a new name and a new god. This is the narrative of him, Sultan Mehmed II, the man history would call Fateh, the conqueror. This is the saga of how a young man, dismissed by the courts of Europe as an inexperienced and rash boy, achieved the impossible, accomplishing what a dozen far more powerful and legendary Islamic caliphs and warriors had failed to do for over 800 years. This is the story of how, in a brutal 53-day siege, he wiped the Eastern Roman Empire, the last living, breathing remnant of imperial Rome, from the face of the earth, extinguishing the light of a city that had for a millennium been the beacon of Christian civilization. The central dramatic paradox lies in this very act. How did this youth, leading an army from a still consolidating empire, manage to breach the most formidable fortifications ever conceived by man and conquer a city that believed itself protected by God himself? The core question is not simply that he did it, but how. What unique and terrible alchemy of personal genius, psychological obsession, revolutionary technology, political cunning, and sheer implacable will allowed one man to so thoroughly unmake the world? Was he merely the beneficiary of a rotting prize, a scavenger picking at the bones of a dead empire? Or was he a true visionary, a military and political prodigy who saw the precise fracture point of his era and struck it with the force of a thunderbolt, shattering the old order to forge a new one in his own image? To understand how he took the eternal city, we must first understand the world that was teetering on the precipice of monumental change, a world of dying empires and hungry new powers, where the clash of civilizations was about to be decided by stone, gunpowder, and the ferocious ambition of a 21-year-old sultan who saw himself as the new Alexander. To understand this man, we must return to the world of the mid-15th century, a geopolitical chessboard drenched in shadow and on the cusp of a violent transformation. The board was dominated by one central, glaring weakness: the Byzantine Empire, which was less an empire and more a ghost haunting the magnificent corpse of its own capital. Once the master of the Mediterranean, its domain had shrunk to the city of Constantinople itself and a few scattered territories. It was a hollowed-out shell, rich in history and religious prestige, but bankrupt in treasure and men, a golden apple rotten to the core. Its ancient walls were its only remaining asset, a symbol of a glorious past that could no longer defend its pathetic present. Trapped within this decaying marvel was a population of perhaps 50,000 souls, praying for a miracle while gazing eastward at the rising power that surrounded them on all sides. That power was the Ottoman Sultanate, a young, virile, and ravenous force of history. Forged in the crucible of Anatolian frontier warfare, it was a militant, centralized state, built for one purpose: conquest. Its armies were disciplined, its bureaucracy was efficient, and its leaders were driven by a potent combination of Ghazi warrior spirit and imperial ambition. Unlike the fractured feudal kingdoms of Europe, the Ottoman state was a sword honed to a razor's edge, and its tip was pointed directly at Constantinople, which the Turks saw not as a venerable mother city of Christendom, but as a strategic and ideological cancer in the very heart of their expanding domains. Meanwhile, the great powers of the Christian West were hopelessly distracted and divided. England and France were just staggering out of the ruinous 100 Years' War, their energies and treasuries utterly depleted. The Holy Roman Empire was a fractured mosaic of competing principalities. The Italian city-states, Venice and Genoa, were the only ones with the naval power to intervene, but they were consumed by their commercial rivalries, viewing the coming crisis less as a holy war and more as a negotiation over trading rights. Most critically, the soul of Christendom was split by the great schism between the Catholic Church of Rome and the Orthodox Church of Byzantium. To the Byzantines, the phrase "better the Sultan's turban than the Pope's tiara" was a common refrain, a bitter expression of the deep-seated theological hatred that paralyzed any chance of a unified defense. This was the world Mehmed inherited: a dying victim, a distracted audience, and a hungry predator poised to strike. The character of this predator was forged in a crucible of humiliation, fear, and relentless ambition. To understand Mehmed the Conqueror, one must first understand the insecure and overlooked prince. He was the third son of Sultan Murad II, a capable and respected ruler who harbored deep reservations about his son's temperament. Mehmed was intense, secretive, and possessed a fiery, unpredictable intelligence that his father mistook for recklessness. The defining trauma of his youth came in 1444, when Murad, weary of war and politics, abdicated the throne to retire to a life of contemplation, placing the 12-year-old Mehmed in power. The courts of Europe and his own viziers saw a child on the throne and immediately pounced. A new Crusader army formed, and the young Sultan's inexperienced leadership led to a crisis so severe that his father's own Grand Vizier, Sandarlı Halil Pasha, orchestrated a Janissary revolt to force Murad to return and reclaim the throne. Mehmed was unceremoniously deposed, a public and searing humiliation that branded itself onto his soul. He was sent away to govern the remote province of Manisa, an effective exile. But this was not a punishment. It was the forging of a weapon. In the solitude of Manisa, he nursed his grievance and cultivated his mind with ferocious intensity. He became fluent in at least 6 languages, including Greek and Latin. He studied the ancient world, becoming obsessed with the life of Alexander the Great, seeing in the Macedonian conqueror a model for his own aspirations. He devoured Islamic theology and science, but also commissioned Italian artists to his court, absorbing the culture of the Renaissance. This period created the unique and dangerous duality of his character. He was at once a pious Muslim warrior dedicated to jihad and a pragmatic Renaissance prince fascinated by Western technology, art, and history. He learned that power was not given, but taken, and that to be underestimated was a powerful weapon. The boy who was cast aside in Manasseh was nursing a singular, world-altering ambition: to reclaim his throne and then to capture the one prize that would erase all memory of his past failure and etch his name in eternity: the city of Constantine. His second ascent to the throne upon his father's death in February of 1451 was the first true demonstration of the man he had become: swift, decisive, and utterly ruthless. While Murad II was a more traditional ruler who had often sought stability and peace with his Christian neighbors, Mehmed's accession sent a tremor of fear through the region. Those who remembered him as the callow boy sultan of a few years prior were about to receive a shocking education. His first and most immediate act was to secure his power internally, and he did so with an act of calculated brutality that defined his reign. According to the Ottoman custom of the time, succession crises were the gravest threat to the stability of the state. To prevent the inevitable civil wars between brothers that had plagued the empire in the past, a grim tradition had emerged: the law of fratricide. Mehmed, taking this principle to its ultimate conclusion, immediately ordered the execution of his only surviving sibling, an infant half-brother named Ahmed, who was drowned in his bath. To leave no doubt about the official nature of this act, he then had the executioner himself put to death. It was a chilling display of realpolitik, a message sent to every corner of the empire and beyond. There would be no internal challengers. There would be no dissent. The state and the Sultan's will were now one and the same. This single act tore away the veil of youthful inexperience and revealed the cold, hard ambition beneath. He was demonstrating that he was bound, not by sentiment, but by the necessities of absolute power. With his domestic flank secured, he could now turn his undivided attention to the great obsession that had been festering since his youth, the prize that hung like a ripe fruit just across the Bosphorus. He renewed treaties with Venice and Hungary, lulling them into a false sense of security, making them believe he was his father's son, a man of peace. But all the while, his gaze was fixed on the walls of Constantinople, and in his mind, the plans for its destruction were already taking shape. At the heart of this grand strategy was not mere territorial ambition, but a deep, burning, and almost mystical obsession. For Mehmed, the conquest of Constantinople was the central purpose of his existence, a drive that transcended politics and entered the realm of sacred destiny. This fixation was known in Ottoman lore as Kizil Elma, the red apple, a term that symbolized the ultimate prize for the Turkic peoples, the final city of conquest that would grant them dominion over the world. For generations, that red apple had been Constantinople. This was not just a personal dream, it was an inheritance. He was acutely aware that his own father, the great Murad II, had besieged the city in 1422 and had failed, a stain on the family honor that Mehmed felt compelled to erase. But the motivation ran even deeper, into the core of his Islamic faith. He was powerfully influenced by a hadith, a reputed saying of the Prophet Muhammad himself, which prophesied, "Verily, you shall conquer Constantinople. What a wonderful leader will he be, and what a wonderful army will that army be." Mehmed saw himself as the direct fulfillment of this sacred prophecy. He was not merely a king seeking territory. He was the divinely appointed instrument of God's will, the wonderful leader destined for this holy task. This belief gave his ambition a terrifying momentum, transforming a military campaign into a sacred duty. It allowed him to rally his soldiers with the promise of divine reward and to justify any act of brutality as part of a cosmic plan. This psychological and theological imperative was the engine driving his every decision. Every diplomatic maneuver, every tax levied, every cannon forged was a step toward this singular goal. He was not simply trying to conquer a city, he was trying to seize his own pre-written destiny, and in doing so, to finally and definitively prove his greatness to the world, to his ancestors, and to the ghost of the humiliated boy sultan he had once been. This grand and perilous ambition, however, was not without its powerful opponents, and the first war Mehmed had to win was the one inside his own court. Upon his accession, he inherited his father's advisors, a council dominated by the old guard, chief among them the immensely powerful and respected Grand Vizier, Sanderli Halil Pasha. Halil was a product of a previous generation of Ottoman statecraft, a man who valued stability, cautious diplomacy, and the careful management of the empire's resources. He had been instrumental in deposing the young Mehmed during his first disastrous reign, and had served Murad II faithfully for decades. He viewed the new sultan's obsession with Constantinople as a reckless and dangerous gamble. He understood the immense cost of a prolonged siege, the diplomatic firestorm it would ignite with Christian Europe, and the very real possibility of failure against the city's legendary defenses. Halil argued that the empire was not ready for such a monumental undertaking, and that a failed siege could destabilize the sultan's rule and invite a new crusade. He represented the voice of caution, tradition, and incremental expansion. In direct opposition to this cautious old guard was a new faction of younger, more aggressive military leaders who had risen with Mehmed, men like Zaganos Pasha and Shihabuddin Pasha. These were the Warhawks, men who shared the Sultan's ambitious vision and saw Constantinople not as a risk, but as a long overdue conquest. Zaganos, in particular, became Mehmed's closest confidant, constantly feeding his ambition, whispering in his ear about glory, destiny, and the fulfillment of prophecy. He argued that the Christian West was too weak and divided to intervene effectively, and that the time to strike was now. This created a deep and bitter schism within the Ottoman High Command, a daily battle of wills fought in the divan. Every strategic decision, every allocation of funds, was a tug-of-war between Halil's pragmatism and Zaganos's zealotry. For Mehmed, this internal conflict was his first great test. He had to navigate the treacherous currents of his own court, skillfully marginalizing the powerful Halil while empowering the loyalists who would help him realize his dream. Winning this internal war was the crucial first step to winning the one against the city's walls. The first physical manifestation of Mehmed's unbending will, and the moment his intentions became terrifyingly clear to the world, was the construction of a massive fortress on the European shore of the Bosphorus Strait in the summer of 1452. The act was a masterpiece of strategic intimidation and logistical prowess. The Byzantines already had a small fortress on the Anatolian side, Anadolu Hisara. In a direct and flagrant violation of all existing treaties, Mehmed ordered the construction of a new, far larger fortress directly opposite it, at the narrowest point of the strait. He named it Rumeli Hisare, which can be translated as Fortress of Roman Land. But it quickly earned a more sinister nickname, Boğazkesin, the throat cutter. The symbolism was brutal and deliberate. The fortress was designed to cut the throat of Constantinople, severing its final lifeline to the Black Sea, from which the city received grain and potential naval aid from the Genoese colonies there. The sheer speed of its construction was a spectacle of power designed to awe and terrify. Mehmed personally supervised the project, marshalling over 6,000 workers, masons, and soldiers. The fortress, with its massive towers and thick walls, rose from the ground with supernatural speed, completed in just over 4 months. Each of its 3 main towers was named after the vizier responsible for its construction, creating a fierce competition that drove the pace. As the Byzantines watched in horror from their city walls just a few miles away, they understood that this was no mere military outpost. It was a declaration of war written in stone and mortar. Emperor Constantine XI sent envoys to protest, pleading with the Sultan to honor the treaties. Mehmed's response was cold and dismissive. "I can do whatever I wish. Both shores of the Bosphorus belong to me, the one because it is inhabited by the Ottomans, and the other because you are not able to defend it." He then had the Byzantine envoys beheaded. The message was now unambiguous. The time for diplomacy was over. The throat-cutter fortress now stood guard, its cannons ready to sink any ship that dared pass without the Sultan's permission, slowly and inexorably tightening the noose around the doomed city. The primary antagonist in this epic drama was not a man, but the city itself. Constantinople was a living legend, a fortress city that had for more than 1,100 years been the capital of a Christian Roman Empire. It was not merely a collection of buildings and people. It was an idea, a symbol of permanence and divine favor. Its heart and soul were its defenses, the most elaborate and successful system of fortifications ever built in the pre-modern world. The legendary Theodosian walls, a triple line of defense stretching 4 miles from the Sea of Marmara to the Golden Horn, were the city's primary shield. They consisted of a wide moat, a low outer wall, a higher inner wall studded with nearly 192 towers, and a final, massive main wall. For 1,000 years, these walls had repelled wave after wave of invaders: Avars, Persians, Arabs, Bulgars, and even Mehmed's own father. They were a testament to the genius of Roman engineering and a source of immense psychological strength for the city's defenders. They believed the city was protected not just by stone, but by the Virgin Mary herself, the Theotokos, whose sacred icons were paraded along the ramparts during times of crisis. The city's other great defender was the sea, with the Golden Horn Inlet providing a secure harbor, its entrance protected by a massive iron chain that could be raised to block enemy ships. The man who stood as the final guardian of this living relic was Emperor Constantine XI Palaiologos. He was a tragic and noble figure, a man born to preside over the death of a civilization. He was a capable soldier and a respected leader, but he inherited a throne with no money, no army, and no allies. His entire reign was a desperate, frantic effort to beg for help from a Western Christendom that despised his Orthodox faith. He faced the impossible task of defending 23 miles of fortifications with a paltry army of perhaps 7,000 men, including a few hundred dedicated Genoese and Venetian volunteers. He was the embodiment of his dying empire, proud, courageous, steeped in a glorious history, but ultimately doomed by the crushing weight of historical circumstance. His adversary was not just Mehmed, but time itself. The fatal mistake that sealed the city's doom was not made by its defenders, but by its supposed friends 1,000 miles away. The ultimate cause of Constantinople's fall lay in the deep, unbridgeable chasm of Christian disunity. For centuries, a bitter theological schism had separated the Orthodox Christianity of the Byzantine East from the Roman Catholic Christianity of the West. The final break in 1054, followed by the catastrophic sack of Constantinople by the Fourth Crusade in 1204, an act of Christian-on-Christian barbarity that the Orthodox world never forgave, had created wounds too deep to heal. As Mehmed prepared his armies, Emperor Constantine XI made one last, desperate plea to the West. He knew his tiny force could not hold out alone, and that only a major European military intervention, a new crusade, could save him. He went so far as to formally agree to the union of the churches at the Council of Florence, submitting the Orthodox Church to papal authority in exchange for military aid. But this was a hollow gesture born of desperation. In Constantinople, his own people met the announcement with riots and fury. The Grand Duke Lucas Notaras famously declared, "I would rather see the Sultan's turban in the midst of the city than the Latin mitre." This internal religious strife crippled the city's will to fight. Meanwhile, in the West, the Pope's calls for a crusade were met with indifference and political maneuvering. The great kingdoms of France and England were exhausted and impoverished after the 100 Years' War. The Holy Roman Emperor was embroiled in his own internal German politics. The only powers with the capacity to intervene swiftly were the Italian maritime republics of Venice and Genoa. Yet, they were mortal enemies, consumed by their commercial rivalry. Both had extensive trading interests in the Ottoman world and were terrified of losing them. They dithered, debated, and sent only a handful of privately funded volunteers, most notably the brave Genoese soldier of fortune, Giovanni Giustiniani Longo, who brought with him a mere 700 men. In the end, the great powers of Christendom offered only prayers and empty promises. They were content to watch from the sidelines as the last bastion of Eastern Christianity faced the storm alone, a fatal miscalculation born of religious bigotry, political myopia, and commercial greed. Mehmed, a keen student of history and a masterful psychologist, saw this fatal flaw in his enemy and exploited it with surgical precision. He understood that the greatest weapon against a coalition is to ensure it never forms in the first place. His diplomacy in the years leading up to the siege was a masterclass in isolating an opponent. He did not present his ambition as a holy war against all of Christendom, which might have provoked a unified response. Instead, he framed it as a limited, local conflict, a final settling of accounts with the troublesome city that stood in the way of his empire's security. He skillfully played on the fears and greed of the Italian city-states. To the Genoese, who held the semi-independent trading colony of Galata, just across the Golden Horn from Constantinople, he promised that their commercial privileges would be protected if they remained neutral. This effectively turned Galata into a passive observer, a neutral island in the middle of the war zone, preventing them from using their formidable naval power to aid the city. To the Venetians, his great naval rivals, he sent messages of reassurance, renewing trade agreements, even as his armies were massing. This sowed confusion and delayed any decisive action from the Venetian Senate, which debated the merits of intervention until it was far too late. He also secured his European flank by making a new 3-year truce with the formidable Hungarian warrior John Hunyadi, ensuring that no land-based crusader army would sweep down from the Balkans to relieve the city. To the Serbian despot, he demanded a contingent of soldiers, making them complicit in the destruction of a fellow Orthodox power. Each of these moves was like a chess piece, methodically pinning his opponent's potential allies to the board, ensuring they could not move. He created a bubble of political and military isolation around Constantinople, transforming it from the capital of an empire into a lonely, friendless island fortress. By the time the first of his great cannons was being dragged towards the city walls in the spring of 1453, the trap he had so carefully laid was sprung. The city was surrounded, its shipping lanes were cut, and Constantine XI finally understood the terrifying truth. No one was coming to help. The world would watch, but he and his tiny garrison were utterly, completely alone. The siege began on April 6, 1453, and for weeks it devolved into a brutal, grinding stalemate. The Theodosian walls, though weakened by centuries of neglect, were still a formidable obstacle, and the defenders, led by the inspirational Emperor Constantine and the brilliant Genoese engineer Giovanni Giustiniani, fought with the courage of desperation. The massive Ottoman cannons could blast holes in the outer walls, but each night the defenders would frantically work to repair the breaches with earth and timber. The Ottoman fleet, numbering over 100 ships, was held at bay by the great iron chain stretched across the mouth of the Golden Horn, the city's vital harbor. A daring raid by 4 Christian ships managed to break through the Ottoman blockade, a humiliating defeat for Mehmed's navy that infuriated the young Sultan. The siege was not going as planned, and murmurs of doubt began to spread through the Ottoman camp, with the cautious old Grand Vizier, Sandarlı Halil Pasha, once again urging a negotiated withdrawal. It was at this critical juncture, with his authority being questioned and his ambition on the line, that Mehmed conceived of a plan so audacious, so outside the bounds of conventional military thinking, that it remains one of the greatest tactical masterstrokes in the history of warfare. He decided that if he could not sail his fleet into the Golden Horn, he would simply move it there by land. On the night of April 22nd, under the cover of darkness and a massive artillery diversion to distract the defenders, an incredible spectacle unfolded. Tens of thousands of Ottoman soldiers and workmen, using countless teams of oxen, began to haul some 70 of their smaller warships out of the Bosphorus, up a steep, wooded hill behind the Genoese colony of Galata, and down into the waters of the Golden Horn. They constructed a massive roadway of greased wooden logs, a slipway over a mile long. The sound of groaning timbers, shouting men, and straining animals filled the night. When the sun rose, the Byzantine defenders looked out upon the waters of their protected harbor in utter disbelief and horror. A new Ottoman fleet, seemingly appearing by magic, now floated in their midst, rendering the great chain useless and outflanking their northern sea walls. It was an act of pure, breathtaking genius, a feat of engineering and willpower that shattered the defenders' morale and changed the entire strategic complexion of the siege. This single act of military genius was more than a tactical victory. It was a profound, psychological turning point for Mehmed himself. As he stood on the hills of Galata, watching his ships, their sails unfurled, seemingly sailing through the forest, he was overcome with a sense of divine affirmation. This was not merely the successful execution of a clever plan, it was a miracle, a sign from Allah that he was indeed the chosen one, the prophesied conqueror. The successful circumvention of the Great Chain, an obstacle that had protected the city for centuries, was proof that no earthly barrier could stand in the way of his destiny. This moment of supreme triumph cemented his belief in his own star, in the concept of a personal fate intertwined with a grand historical purpose. It silenced, once and for all, the whispering doubts of the old guard in his camp. The cautious Grand Vizier, Sandarlı Halil Pasha, and his faction were marginalized. Their arguments for a negotiated peace now seemed timid and foolish in the face of such a spectacular success. The Sultan's authority became absolute, his word unquestionable. From this point forward, he was possessed by a fearsome, almost serene self-confidence. He saw himself as operating on a higher plane than ordinary men, a peer of Alexander and Caesar, rewriting the rules of warfare and history itself. This sense of hubris, this unshakable belief in his own anointment by destiny, would fuel the final, brutal stages of the siege. He would no longer entertain any thoughts of failure or compromise. The city was his, granted to him by God, and all that remained was the final act of taking possession of it. This psychological transformation from an ambitious sultan into a self-perceived instrument of fate, was perhaps his most powerful weapon, giving him the terrifying resolve needed to push his army and his war machine to the absolute limit to achieve the final, bloody victory. The conflict for Constantinople ultimately became an intimate duel of wills between two starkly contrasting figures, each the perfect embodiment of the world they represented. On one side was Sultan Mehmed II, the face of the future. He was young, dynamic, and a master of the new technologies and ruthless pragmatism that would define the coming age. He was a Renaissance prince in Ottoman garb, a man who could discuss Greek philosophy in one moment and order the casting of a monstrous, city-breaking cannon in the next. His worldview was expansive and forward-looking. He saw Constantinople not as the end of a campaign, but as the beginning of a new global empire, a new Rome with himself as its Caesar. His energy was predatory, his ambition boundless, and his methods were coldly efficient. He commanded a vast, well-organized, multi-ethnic army, a modern war machine fueled by centralized bureaucracy and religious zeal. He represented the inexorable, unsentimental force of historical change. On the other side stood Emperor Constantine XI Palaiologos, the last ghost of the ancient world. He was a man defined by duty, history, and a profound, tragic nobility. Where Mehmed had a massive army, Constantine had only a handful of loyal followers. Where Mehmed commanded revolutionary cannons, Constantine had only crumbling ancient walls. Where Mehmed was driven by a vision of future glory, Constantine was sustained only by the memory of a glorious past. He was fighting not for conquest, but for survival, not for a new empire, but for the honorable death of the old one. His leadership during the siege was an act of pure, desperate courage. He was everywhere along the walls, rallying his exhausted troops, personally supervising repairs, fighting alongside the common soldiers, a purple-robed emperor covered in dust and grime. He was the living embodiment of the city itself. Weary, besieged, abandoned by its friends, but refusing to surrender its dignity. The personal chemistry of this conflict was one of predator and prey, of a rising tide crashing against a crumbling cliff. It was the new world, armed with gunpowder and unshakable self-belief, coming to devour the old. Central to Mehmed's new world of warfare was his complete and revolutionary embrace of gunpowder technology. While cannons had been used in European sieges for decades, they were often unreliable and of limited effectiveness against major fortifications. Mehmed, however, saw their potential not as a supporting weapon, but as the primary instrument of destruction. He understood that to break the Theodosian walls, he needed artillery on an unprecedented scale. He actively sought out the best engineers in the world, and his search led him to a shadowy Hungarian master craftsman named Orban. Orban had first offered his services to the Byzantines, but Emperor Constantine, his treasury empty, could not afford his price. Mehmed, by contrast, welcomed him with open arms and gave him limitless resources, asking him only one question: "Can you cast a cannon that can smash the walls of Babylon?" Orban promised he could, and at the foundry in the Ottoman capital of Edirne, he produced a series of monstrous bronze cannons, the likes of which the world had never seen. The largest of these, the Basilic, or the Great Turkish Bombard, was a true behemoth, over 27 feet long, capable of firing a 1,200-pound marble cannonball over a mile. It took 60 oxen and hundreds of men to drag the monster to the siege lines. This supergun, along with dozens of other large bombards, formed the heart of Mehmed's strategy. They were a technological key designed to unlock a 1,000-year-old defense, but his military machine was more than just its cannons. The elite corps of the Janissaries, an infantry unit of slave soldiers taken as boys from Christian Balkan families and raised in a fanatically loyal Islamic military order, formed the disciplined core of his army. They were the first modern standing army in Europe, professional soldiers who lived and trained for war year-round. They were supported by a vast and well-organized apparatus of engineers who dug tunnels to mine the walls from below, and a massive logistical train that kept his army of over 100,000 men fed, supplied, and paid for the duration of the 53-day siege. This combination of revolutionary technology, professional soldiery, and meticulous organization made Mehmed's army a truly modern fighting force, one that the small, ad hoc collection of Byzantine defenders could not hope to match. The relentless technological assault was amplified by a campaign of spiritual warfare, transforming the siege into a cosmic event for the Ottoman soldiers. Mehmed understood that the morale of his massive, diverse army was as crucial as his great cannons. From the very beginning, he framed the campaign not merely as a conquest for imperial glory, but as a sacred duty, the ultimate jihad. The camp was filled with charismatic dervishes and stern imams who moved among the troops, their voices rising day and night with recitations from the Quran. They constantly reminded the soldiers of the ancient prophecy of the Prophet Muhammad, promising the conquest of Constantinople. This transformed every soldier, from the lowest irregular Bashi Bazouk to the highest-ranking Janissary Aga, into a participant in a divinely ordained mission. They were not just fighting for the Sultan, they were fighting for Allah. The promise of reward was twofold and absolute. For those who survived, there was the promise of immense booty, 3 days of unrestricted plunder of one of the wealthiest cities in the world. For those who fell in battle, there was the even greater promise of shahada, or martyrdom, which guaranteed immediate entry into paradise. This potent spiritual cocktail created a formidable fighting spirit, an acceptance of death that the Christian defenders, fighting for their earthly lives and homes, found terrifying. On the eve of the final assault, Mehmed himself rode through the camp, promising his troops that he was fulfilling the will of God, and that victory was preordained. The entire Ottoman camp was lit with bonfires, and the sound of thousands of men chanting, "Allahu Akbar," rolled across the battlefield like thunder, a terrifying psychological blow to the exhausted defenders shivering on the walls. This fusion of military might and religious fanaticism was one of Mehmed's most powerful creations, turning his army into a battering ram of both flesh and faith. As the siege dragged into its 7th week, the relentless combination of physical and psychological pressure began to create the first true cracks in the city's ancient defenses and in the morale of its people. The daily routine became a living nightmare for the inhabitants of Constantinople. The day began with the thunderous roar of the great bombards, a sound so powerful it was said to be heard for miles, causing women to faint and miscarry in the streets. Each explosion of a massive stone ball against the walls was not just a physical blow, but a psychological one, a constant reminder that their legendary fortifications were being methodically pulverized. Dust and fear became the air they breathed. By night, the exhausted defenders, a mere few thousand men stretched thin across miles of walls, would scramble to repair the breaches, piling barrels of earth, stones, and timber into the gaping holes, knowing that the dawn would bring another round of destruction. Hope, their most vital resource, began to drain away. Every day they scanned the horizon for the sight of Venetian or Genoese sails, for the relief fleet that had been promised, but the sea remained empty. A sense of profound abandonment set in, the feeling that God and the Christian world had forsaken them. Ominous portents were seen everywhere. A thick, unnerving fog, unheard of in late May, blanketed the city for days, interpreted as a sign that God was hiding his face. During a solemn religious procession, the most sacred icon of the Virgin Mary, the city's protector, slipped and fell from its platform, a horrifying omen for the onlookers. The final, most terrifying sign came on the night of May 22nd, when a strange, fiery light was seen glowing around the dome of the Hagia Sophia, which some interpreted as the Holy Spirit departing from the great cathedral. For a people steeped in mysticism and prophecy, these events were as devastating as the Ottoman cannons. The cracks were appearing not just in the ancient stone, but in the very soul of the city. With the city physically and spiritually broken, and his own army growing restless, Mehmed made the fateful decision that would seal history. His war council was deeply divided. The old Grand Vizier, Sandarlı Halil Pasha, who may have been secretly receiving bribes from the Byzantines, made one last, forceful argument for a negotiated settlement. He pointed to the resilience of the defenders, the immense cost of the siege, and the looming threat of a Hungarian relief force or a Venetian fleet finally arriving. He urged the Sultan to accept a Byzantine offer of a massive annual tribute in exchange for lifting the siege. It was the safe, pragmatic choice. But Mehmed was not a man of pragmatism. He was a man of destiny. He listened to the counsel of his war hawk general, Zaganos Pasha, who furiously argued that to retreat now would be an act of unforgivable weakness. Zaganos insisted that the defenders were at their absolute breaking point, and that one final, overwhelming assault would shatter them. The psychology behind Mehmed's decision was complex. He was driven by his unshakable belief in the prophecies and the omens of victory he saw everywhere. He was also a canny commander who understood the psychology of his own men. The Janissaries and other troops had been promised plunder, and to deny them now could risk a mutiny. Finally, and perhaps most importantly, this was his ultimate test against the ghost of his father and the humiliation of his youth. To accept a tribute would be a partial victory, another compromise like those his father would have made. Only the total conquest of the city could fully exorcise his demons and establish his legacy. He sided with Zaganos. Standing before his assembled commanders, he announced his decision. On the night of May 28th, they would launch a massive, three-wave, all-out human assault designed to overwhelm the exhausted defenders by sheer force of numbers. It was an enormous gamble, risking his entire army and his throne on one final bloody throw of the dice. The final assault began in the dead of night, before the moon had risen, under a sky lit only by the stars and the flickering torches of the Ottoman camp. It was a symphony of hellish noise and fury, meticulously designed by Mehmed to break the defenders through sheer exhaustion and terror. The first wave, thrown forward around 1:30 in the morning, consisted of tens of thousands of Bashi bazooks, the irregular mercenaries and conscripts of his army. They were poorly armed, but numerous. A human tide sent crashing against the walls with the sole purpose of absorbing the first volleys of the defenders' arrows and oil, and, most importantly, of tiring them out. For 2 hours, this savage wave was repulsed with horrific casualties. Then came the second wave, the disciplined, heavily armored Anatolian Turkish regiments. They advanced with ladders and siege engines, pressing the attack with greater skill and focus, forcing the defenders, who had not slept, to fight with renewed desperation. The fighting was hand-to-hand, brutal and intimate, on the crumbling ramparts. Emperor Constantine himself raced along the walls, a sword in his hand, fighting and rallying his men. But the true catastrophe struck around dawn. Two events occurred almost simultaneously. First, the brilliant Genoese commander, Giovanni Giustiniani Longo, the heart and soul of the defense, was grievously wounded by a cannonball fragment and had to be carried from the walls, a sight that caused a panic among his men. At that exact moment, a small group of Ottoman soldiers discovered that a tiny postern gate in the northern section of the walls, the Kirka Porta, had been left unbolted. They poured through, seized the tower above it, and raised the Ottoman banner from the top of the wall. The sight of the crescent flag flying within the city shattered the remaining morale of the defenders. The final, unstoppable wave, the elite, white-clad Janissaries, whom Mehmed had held in reserve, now advanced with terrifying discipline into the breach. The defense collapsed. It was no longer a battle. It was a massacre. The collapse of the Theodosian walls was the collapse of a world. As the Janissaries secured the breaches and threw open the main gates, the Ottoman army poured into the city, and the organized defense dissolved into a desperate, street-by-street fight for survival. This was the moment the soldiers had been promised. For 3 days and 3 nights, the city was given over to systematic plunder, an explosion of pent-up violence, greed, and religious fury. What followed was a horror of unimaginable proportions. Houses were broken into, palaces were stripped bare, and churches, filled with terrified civilians praying for a last-minute miracle, were turned into slaughterhouses. The streets ran with blood as thousands were cut down where they stood. Tens of thousands more, by some estimates as many as 50,000, were rounded up, chained, and dragged away to the slave markets. Priceless relics of classical and Christian civilization, manuscripts, icons, statues, and artworks accumulated over a millennium, were destroyed, melted down, or lost forever. In the midst of this chaos, Emperor Constantine XI Palaiologos, the last Roman emperor, met his end. Seeing that all was lost, he reportedly tore off his imperial regalia, proclaiming, "The city is fallen, and I am still alive," and charged with his last remaining men into the oncoming wave of Janissaries. He died as he had lived, a soldier fighting for a lost cause, and his body was never definitively identified. The climax of this cataclysm was Mehmed's ceremonial entry into the conquered city. He rode directly to the Hagia Sophia, dismounted, and entered the great church. As his soldiers looted the magnificent interior, he walked to the high altar, and an imam ascended the pulpit to proclaim the Shahada, the Islamic declaration of faith. In that moment, the greatest cathedral in Christendom, the heart of the Orthodox world for 900 years, was transformed into an imperial mosque, a symbol of the final, absolute victory of Islam over the Eastern Roman Empire. After the initial chaos of the 3 days of plunder subsided, Mehmed began the process of transforming the conquered city into the capital of his own new empire. His finale was not an end, but a new beginning, marked by a moment of profound and recorded introspection. He rode through the silent, desolate streets, through the ruined forums and the plundered palaces of the Byzantine emperors, including the great palace of Bucolion. The scale of the destruction was immense. The silence of the depopulated city was deafening. Looking upon the empty halls and shattered marble, a sense of melancholy victory seemed to wash over the young Sultan. It was here, according to the Ottoman chroniclers, that he softly recited a famous couplet from the Persian poet Sa'di. The spider weaves the curtains in the palace of the Caesars. The owl calls the watches in the towers of Afrasiab. It was a poignant reflection on the transient nature of power and the inevitable decay of all earthly empires, even the greatest. This moment reveals the complexity of the man. He was not just a brutal conqueror, but a student of history, acutely aware of his own place in the long succession of empires. He saw himself not as a destroyer, but as a successor. By conquering the city, he had not ended the Roman Empire, but had, in his own mind, inherited it. He immediately began the work of repopulating and rebuilding the city, which he would rename Istanbul. He declared himself Kaiseri Rum, the Caesar of Rome, claiming the mantle of the emperors he had just vanquished. The man who entered the city was Sultan Mehmed II, the man who began to rebuild it, who walked through its silent ruins and contemplated the verdict of history, was now something more. He was Fatih Sultan Mehmed, Mehmed the Conqueror, and his great, terrible work was complete. The legacy of Mehmed II is, to this day, a landscape of fierce and irreconcilable conflict, a testament to the fact that one man's hero is another's destroyer. His historical interpretation is split neatly along civilizational and religious lines. In modern Turkey and across much of the Islamic world, he is revered as one of the greatest heroes in history. He is Fatih, the Conqueror, a national icon whose name adorns bridges, universities, and entire districts of Istanbul. He is celebrated as a military genius, a divinely guided warrior who fulfilled an Islamic prophecy, and a brilliant, multilingual statesman who transformed the Ottoman state into a true world empire. His conquest of Constantinople is viewed as a moment of liberation, a glorious victory that established a new era of power, culture, and Islamic piety. He is seen as a patron of the arts and sciences, a lawgiver, and the true founder of the Ottoman Empire's golden age. His portrait hangs in schools and government buildings, a symbol of national pride and historical achievement. In the West, and particularly in Greece, and throughout the Orthodox Christian world, his image is precisely the opposite. Here, he is cast as the Antichrist, a brutal tyrant, and the man responsible for one of the greatest acts of cultural vandalism in human history. The fall of Constantinople in 1453 is mourned as a cataclysm, a day of profound civilizational trauma. He is seen as the destroyer of the Byzantine Empire, the man who extinguished the last light of Eastern Rome and subjected the Greek people to centuries of Turkish rule, a period often referred to as the Turkokratia, or Turkish occupation. His conversion of the Hagia Sophia into a mosque is viewed not as an act of piety, but as an act of profound desecration, a symbol of conquest and cultural suppression. For this half of the world, he is not a great statesman, but a ruthless warlord whose primary legacy was the destruction of a vibrant and ancient Christian civilization, an act that created a fault line between Christianity and Islam that continues to shape global politics to this day. So we return to the core question: how did he do it? How did a 21-year-old sultan wipe a 1,000-year-old empire from the face of the earth? The final comprehensive answer is that it was not one factor, but a perfect and terrible storm, a confluence of 5 critical elements that came together at a single point in history. First was the man himself. Mehmed was a singular genius, a man possessed of a rare combination of obsessive ambition, ruthless pragmatism, intellectual curiosity, and an unshakable belief in his own destiny. He was a master of logistics, psychology, and technology, a true Renaissance figure who outthought and outwilled his opponents at every turn. Second was the state of his victim. The Byzantine Empire was a hollow crown, an empire in name only. It lacked the manpower, the wealth, and the political will to defend itself properly. It was a rotting fruit, ready to be plucked from the tree by the first determined hand. Third was the fatal paralysis of the wider world. Christian Europe was too divided by politics, too consumed by its own rivalries, and too poisoned by theological hatred to mount a unified defense. Constantinople's greatest tragedy was that it died alone, abandoned by its friends, while its enemies were at the gates. Fourth, and perhaps most decisively, was the technological revolution. Mehmed's enthusiastic and large-scale use of gunpowder artillery. His great bombards were the key that unlocked the city. They rendered the medieval stone fortifications that had protected the city for a millennium obsolete, literally blasting a new era of warfare into existence. Finally, there was the element of masterful strategy. From the construction of Rumeli-Hisara to the moving of his fleet overland into the Golden Horn, Mehmed consistently outmaneuvered his opponents with acts of audacious, unconventional brilliance that broke not only their defensive lines, but also their spirit. It was this perfect alignment of a visionary leader, a weak target, a distracted world, a disruptive technology, and a flawless strategy that allowed the impossible to become inevitable. The verdict of history, therefore, is that the fall of Constantinople was far more than the conquest of a single city. It was a civilizational inflection point, one of the true turning points when the world pivoted on its axis. The life of Mehmed the Conqueror stands as a brutal and timeless lesson on the nature of power, history, and change. His story demonstrates that history is not merely a slow, inevitable tide, but can be violently redirected by the force of a single, focused human will. He proved that ancient institutions, no matter how venerable or seemingly permanent, can be shattered in an instant when they fail to adapt to new realities, new technologies, and new, more aggressive forms of power. The breaching of the Theodosian walls by gunpowder cannons was a metaphor for the end of an age. It was the definitive, explosive announcement that the medieval world of knights, castles, and walled cities was over, and the modern world of cannons, empires, and nation-states had begun. The flood of Greek scholars fleeing the fallen city to Italy would help fuel the full blossoming of the Renaissance in the West, while the Ottoman control of the old trade routes would spur European explorers like Columbus and da Gama to seek new sea routes to the east, inaugurating the Age of Discovery. Mehmed's life is a testament to the clash of civilizations, not just as a military conflict, but as a contest of vitality, organization, and belief. He showed that a young, hungry, and unified power, driven by a compelling ideology and armed with revolutionary tools, will almost always triumph over an older, divided, and complacent one that relies on the glory of its past. The final, indelible frame of this epic saga is not one of battle or destruction, but of a powerful and enduring symbol. It is the image of the massive, golden dome of the Hagia Sophia, for 900 years the largest enclosed space in the world and the beating heart of Orthodox Christendom, now silhouetted against a setting sun. And rising from the ancient Christian structure are the new, slender forms of 4 minarets, added by the conqueror and his successors, their pointed tips reaching towards the heavens. Atop the great dome, the Christian cross has been taken down, and in its place is a golden crescent, the symbol of Islam, gleaming in the last light of day. This single image encapsulates the entire story. It is the visual representation of a world remade, a testament to an act of conquest so profound that it did not just capture a city, but redefined it, absorbing its history, its grandeur, and its very soul, and rebirthing it as something entirely new. The 1,000-year-old Christian city of Constantinople was gone, wiped from the map with a finality that still echoes through time. In its place stood Istanbul, the new capital of a new Roman Empire, the eternal monument not just to a great battle, but to the ferocious, unbending, and world-altering will of its conqueror.